Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, Yarby Laws, and this is my co-host,
Christopher Wells.
We appreciate all the support on our recent content, and before we do get started, please don't forget to like and subscribe, and follow us on Instagram and TikTok at the OBT Podcast for more content and updates.
Yes, so we are going into the new week, and we're recording this maybe a little before this final NBA Summer League game. Doesn't really mean much at this point. Obviously, both teams are led by a couple of guys in the draft, right? Like you have Nick Clifford for the Kings, who we talked about in our last episode, and then Con Kneppel for the Hornets, who after his first game that we saw in person, he struggled. He's been better since that point. But most of what we're talking about from here on out, from here until going into the preseason, is starting next episode, we'll probably do some off-season breakdown. So, but for now, we do have a few things to talk about. So we'll start with Marcus Smart getting bought out from the Washington Wizards and joining the Los Angeles Lakers on a reportedly 2-year, $11 million deal. Now, there are a few things that have to be taken care of, so they're going to give him the biannual exception. But in order to have access to it, they have to free up money. So earlier today, before we recorded, they waived Shake Milton. So that frees up a little bit, but they still have to do something else. So the options are, waive Jordan Goodwin or, make a trade. But first, we'll talk about the actual player, Marcus Smart, right? Where the last few years have been kind of an adventure for him, right? Because obviously the first year that we recorded this podcast, he was in Boston. That was his last year in Boston. And he started, and it was kind of year 2 of he's the starting point guard experiment, right? And he played 61 games that year, gave him about 11 and 6, 42 from the field, 34 from 3. And then in the playoffs, right, we know what happened with the Celtics. He actually played better in the playoffs than he did in the regular season, but that Celtics team, once they played the Heat, kind of fell apart, went down 3-0, tied it up to go to Game 7, then Tatum hurts his ankle in Game 7, and then that's it. It's over for the Heat. Even though he plays, nobody for the Celtics really played well. But either way, then they obviously, as we know, they make all those moves, and Smart's gone. He goes to Memphis, right? But he doesn't play a lot for Memphis. In his 2 years in Memphis, or 2 seasons, he played 20 the first year, and then 19 this past season. Then he was traded to the Wizards and only played 15. So in the past 2 seasons, he's only played in, about 44 games or so, right? Over the course of math-wise, yeah, I guess that'd be about 34, right? And then 34 plus 20. So, yeah, so he's played in very few games the last couple of seasons. And, we know he's an injury-prone guy. He's had some stretches where his style of play can kind of lead to injuries and whatnot. When he plays, right, he's been solid for, his teams. But then you still have the problem of, is he the same guy? He's only 31, but if you're looking at it from a Lakers perspective, you're getting a guy who's going to come in as one of the best defensive guards or perimeter guys on your team. Although now he actually really guards up more. He doesn't guard as many perimeter guys, smaller guys. He actually guards a lot more forwards, bigger players. But it's still a better option defensively than most of what's on the rest of the Lakers roster. Because if you look at the Laker roster, right, in terms of the guard depth, right, because you have the starting backcourt with Luka and Austin, and then when you move off of that, then it gets kind of dark, right? Because then you're talking about Gabe Vincent, right, who played well in Miami. He's been not that great as a Laker, right? That contract hasn't really worked out. And then other than that, right, Jordan Goodwin, who we don't know if he'll be on the roster before the season starts. And then Dalton Connect, Bronny James, right? So just not a lot of great options at that guard spot, especially from a defensive standpoint that would be in the normal rotation. So he can step in and he can play, either guard or forward next to the main guys. I'm curious to see what his role is, how many minutes. He was sought after by a couple of other teams as well, reportedly the Phoenix Suns and the Milwaukee Bucks, according to Shams Charania of ESPN. But, in the end, the reporting was Luka was able to get it over the finish line, right? He recruited him. Seemingly, I guess, also recruited Ayton as well, right? So kind of now, I guess, taking over the role of, what the front office has kind of been putting out there where, like, this is his team, where it's like, this is the guy going forward to kind of build around. So, if you look at the Lakers' acquisitions in totality, right? You lost Dorian Finney-Smith, but you did bring in Marcus Smart, right? Who, even though he's not quite the same player, he should still be productive. Then you lost Dorian Finney-Smith, but you replaced him with Jake LaRavia and DeAndre Ayton. And then they drafted a Thiero, right, with the 36th or whatever pick it was. We'll see how much he plays. So, again, the main thing is that there's still work to be done. But if you're just looking at it from on the margins, it's probably a little bit better than I think what you would have expected going into free agency, mainly because most of these guys we didn't really look at as Laker targets, right? Like Ayton wasn't even a free agent going into free agency. He was on the Portland Trailblazers team. We thought he might be a trade guy for teams, not necessarily a buyout guy. Smart, we kind of thought could get bought out, but you just never know, right? Like you're not automatically thinking about a guy who's still on a team going into free agency because, those guys don't usually get bought out right away. But, overall, if he can just slide in and be, a regular contributor defensively, he's got some ball handling point guard chops. Not that you want him running the offense, but so much, but, he can do that. And he's a veteran, right? He's been on a bunch of playoff teams because the Celtics, when he was there, went on a lot of deep runs. Again, he is a guy that can be kind of up and down, especially offensively, right? Like if you look at his offensive numbers, right, they're not that great, right, for his career. He shoots below 40% from the field and just over 32% from three, right? So not really that ideal offensively. But again, you're getting a guy for free, right, who is a guy who's a vet, right, who can help you defensively. And that's an area of need for the Lakers because we know that a lot of the issues that they have right now, depth and defense, they don't really have a lot of that on the roster because once you get to the back end of the roster, it's not that great. And then when you look at even the starters, right, that defensive grouping is not that great either, right? Because there's not a lot of guys on this team that you look at as that's what they do. They're on a team because of their defense, right? Smart can still be one of those guys, former defensive player of the year, even though he's not that anymore. But for a guy you got on the buyout market, that's a solid acquisition. And, those are three solid acquisitions where, again, it's never great to lose a guy that you had because they gave up multiple seconds to get him. But it does at least ease the pain a little bit. Then you just kind of have to figure out that last bit that I mentioned where they still have to be able to free up the space in order to get him because they're still in that apron tier where they don't have the biannual exception. So whether or not it comes from waiving Jordan Goodwin, who was a very useful player for them the second half of the regular season, or do they try to make a consolidation trade and maybe move some of those other guys? Could you move Maxi Kleber? Could you move Gabe Vincent? Maybe you have to, not that you want to, but like maybe you kind of trade Rui because you don't think he fits. I'm not sure, but they probably would still need to do that. If you can do all of that and get back some type of solid two-way wing or point of attack guy, like this could be a really, really good team. Because I think we know that this team, regular season wise, will probably be a top 6 team seed wise in the Western Conference. But we're just skeptical about how far can they realistically go in the playoffs. Can they win more than one round? And that's where, as currently constructed, you're not quite there yet because of the defensive concerns. But this at least puts you closer to that.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's amazing. I think, his experience I think is going to shine through a lot, right? He's been to what? I think it was like 4 or 5 straight conference finals appearances right before he was traded off of Boston. So like you said, he's been there, he's a known winner. He knows what it takes to get to these spots that the Lakers obviously want to be in, but also like fit wise, right? Like you said, more of a 2, but can easily play the 3. And I think, him slotting into the 3 spot as the starter would be perfect, right? Because you'd have Luka, AR, Marcus Smart, Braun, and then Ayton, right? So I'd feel pretty confident about that. And it's like you said, like this guy makes his money off his defense, right? Like you're not asking this guy to be an offensive initiator. This guy's a stopper, right? And a versatile one at that. Pretty much guard 1 through 4. So I do like, them being able to get this kind of caliber of a player on the buyout market. That's phenomenal for the Lakers.
Right.
And yeah, I think he's going to be great. I think, like you said, he's nowhere near the Depoy, conversation at all. But he's going to be so valuable to this team that he's going to be their anchor, because I think you and I both know DeAndre Ayton would not be their defensive anchor. So Marcus Smart it is, I think, here. And I love it. I have no complaints from me.
Right. Yeah. Like it's a good move where you got a guy on the buyout market who helps you in an area that you need help with and you got him for nothing.
Yeah.
So you do this 10 times out of 10. And again, it was a competitive market because it was already reported that those other teams were after him. And those are also teams that could use, defensive guys, right? Like Phoenix certainly could use an extra defensive player, as could Milwaukee. So, the key here, right, is the part that Shams mentioned was the Luka piece, right? Where, he recruited him reportedly, right? And I guess convinced him like, yeah, come over here. You'll have an opportunity to play. You'll have an opportunity to potentially contend, right? And that's kind of an important thing. And that's a good thing, right? At least from the perspective of you have a guy, a franchise player who can be a guy that can be able to convince guys to come here. Because at one time, right, like before the last couple of seasons, like the Lakers were able to do that when they had LeBron and AD, where they were able to kind of get guys to come there for, relatively little. And you're like, wow, how'd they get that guy, right? Like it would be, like I know he's not in the league anymore, but say like a Montrezl Harrell, right? Or Malik Monk, right? That's a guy where everybody was like, wow, how did they get him to come on a minimum contract, right? You would think he would have gone somewhere else for maybe a little bit more, right? Even the title year, right? There were a couple of guys that came there where you're like, oh wow, I wouldn't have expected them to go there, right? I mean, he didn't end up playing, but say like a DeMarcus Cousins, right? It's a similar type of thing, and that hasn't really been the case the last couple of seasons, right? But now that you have Luka, you do have a guy where, yeah, like even in Dallas, right? Like before he got traded, they were able to get, all those acquisitions the last summer where it was like Klay Thompson and Najee Marshall, right? And, the other guys that they added on the roster too, right? So that's kind of an important thing for your franchise moving forward. Does this, and I guess obviously when we go down the line and do our offseason thought processes, what else do you think they need, right? Because they're not, I can't imagine that they're completely done. At the very least, like you can go into the season and feel better about the roster. But what do you think about the roster as a whole, at least as of right now? Like, what do you think is missing?
Um, I mean, like it's cool. I like the starting five. Do I like the depth at every position? No,
Mm-hmm.
because
Right.
like at point guard, right? I guess you could count Marcus Smart in there now. I guess if you really wanted to, but like beyond that, right? You have Gabe Vincent and Bronny James, right? So that kind of scares me in terms of what the PG rotation is going to look like. Shooting guard, you'd have AR, potentially Jordan, Goodwin, and Connect. That's
Mm-hmm.
okay. Like that's fine. But then I think small forward is where I have some concerns, because yeah, you do have a great player, Marcus Smart, but then you have to kind of go down to Jake LaRavia and the rookie that they drafted as well. So
Right.
maybe some more wing depth. That's why I think losing Dorian Finney-Smith does hurt, because he was kind of like your only true, I guess, like 3-and-D elite wing like that. So if you could potentially get somebody to replicate that, because I don't think LaRavia is at that point yet. He can be for sure, but defensively, I don't think he's anywhere near Finney-Smith. So I
Mm-hmm.
think they would need that. Um, yeah, you would either need that at the 3 or the 4, because I think you would want to do your best ability to replicate, the Dallas team that that went to the NBA Finals previously. So, in terms of personnel and construction, right? So, I'm kind of waiting on them to do that. I think this is a great first step, but like you said, they're not done. They can't be done.
Right. And that's kind of the thing where financially, with that Marcus Smart move, like I already mentioned, they have to free up the money in order to do it. So, like I said, the option is either make a trade to consolidate the roster or waive Goodwin. Now, from what I understand, right, a trade would also help, them duck the apron even more. So, like, kind of just a no-brainer, right? A trade would be more preferable than just waiving Jordan Goodwin, right? Because like if you just replace his salary with somebody else, then you're still pretty close, and you just don't have a whole lot of flexibility.
Mm-hmm.
Now they do have an extra roster spot, and that will be used for Marcus Smart, but they would need to probably, like I said, make a trade or something, and I'm not sure which one they're gonna do, right? Because they don't have to sign Marcus Smart right away, like at least as of right now, like it's kind of like a verbal agreement, and he hasn't cleared waivers just yet. So I think what is it, like 48 hours or whatever since, after he clears waivers, which I think was not too long ago. It was like earlier in the evening on Sunday.
Mm-hmm.
So there's like a couple days in time where they'll have, time to kind of look around and scour around and see what, they can do, find whatever they're going to do with that. But, just as a whole, and then also I guess, the transition, right, where now it seems like Luka is kind of the steward of the franchise or the foundation of it, right? Where like now they're going to kind of, like you mentioned, like ideally you kind of try to see if you can put together some type of team that's similar to the Dallas team. Obviously, you don't have Kyrie, and at least as of right now, you don't really have the wings necessarily, right? Because Dallas had both threes and fours that they could kind of put together on the roster, but with the Lakers, it's mostly guys that are fours, right? Like LeBron's a four, Vando's a four, right? Rui's a four, right? And or speaking of a guy like Rui, like what would you do with Rui, right? Would you considering like where they're at right now, like is he kind of the main guy that you're looking at for a trade? Because I would, in terms of like Austin Reeves, because of his contract, it just doesn't feel like it makes a whole lot of sense to move him unless you're getting somebody that's as good or better. Whereas like with Rui, like you don't want a bench player, but it's probably a little bit easier to find a player that's similar to Rui's tier than like an Austin.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, like Rui's great, and I'm sure as a Lakers fan, like you can attest to that. Like how
Right.
good and versatile he is on the offensive end. But is that really what you need? Right? Is that really what this team needs? At the end of the day, like if they really want to contend, I think they should really lean into a defensive identity. To surround Luka, Braun, and Austin Reeves. With that kind of athleticism, that kind of defense and shooting ability. So I think you would probably want to look elsewhere and yeah, move on from Rui. Like I said, great offensive, versatile guy, but I would prioritize defensive versatility rather than offensive versatility, especially considering, who's in the starting lineup, right? Like DeAndre Ayton's not, an amazing rim protector. So I think you would need to find that elsewhere.
Yeah, and you also kind of mentioned it sounded like you were saying earlier that you view Marcus Smart as a starter, right? At least as currently
Yeah.
constructed. So like if they didn't make a trade, you would just start Marcus Smart over Rui.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. I would go Luca, AR, Smart at the three, and then LeBron at the four, and DeAndre Ayton at the five.
Yeah, yeah, I'm curious to see if that would happen just because he's been the starter for a while. So you almost kind of feel like maybe not, but I guess it depends on how the Lakers view him going forward because I feel like they do like him,
Mm-hmm.
but then you still have the issue of, well, he's on the last year of his deal. So what are you going to do? Are you just going to let him walk? Are you going to re-sign him? Are you going to extend him?
Mm-hmm.
Right? And depending on what the answer to that question is, then you kind of have to make a decision, right? Like if the plan is not to extend him or bring him, then I would think you kind of almost would have to trade him because I don't really like the idea of just letting him walk. I know that that has happened more recently with some of these teams because of the financial flexibility, and maybe that is what happens. But I guess the question is, do you think that Rui will be on the team at the beginning of the season? Like, do you expect that he will be traded or regardless, like if they don't trade him, then he just walks and leaves and they don't bring him back? Like, what do you think?
Um, I think you probably won't see him get moved till the deadline. I think he screams more deadline to me because, like you said, there's definitely an affinity between the two parties here. So I think realistically, you'd want to probably do everything in your power to keep Rui just because of how good he is offensively. But you do have to kind of look at it. Well, does he fit really well with Luca, right? And I think that's kind of going to be the outlook. So they'll probably look at it for around half the season, and then come deadline, they'll probably figure something out.
Yeah, we'll see what happens. I mean, again, if the right deal comes along, they'll do it. And as of right now, we don't know what those deals are, right? Like we know that they're active, but the only thing we had heard in recent memory was the Wiggins thing. That seems like it's dead. But, whatever else is going on, we don't really know about as of right now, right? Like people have kind of based off of some of the things that they've heard, right, have kind of mentioned maybe some teams like Portland and maybe a couple areas. Marcus Smart was considered a trade candidate at one point, but then I guess they were like, well, he'll probably get bought out, so there's no real reason to do that. And yeah, this was more ideal than giving up stuff to get him. So we'll see what happens. I mean, I don't know what to expect because we know that Lakers usually oftentimes do a lot of things that you don't see coming. I know the smart thing kind of had some rumblings to it, but just as a whole, like it wasn't banked in. It
Hmm.
wasn't like anybody was saying, "Yeah, you can book Marcus Smart going to the Lakers."
Right.
Because I think a few weeks ago, at one time, right, everybody was saying DeAnthony Melton was a lock to go there, right? And then you fast forward now, and most people think he'll go to Golden State, although he hasn't signed as of yet because we're still waiting on this Kaminga stuff.
Hmm. Yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah, so moving on, right? Summer League is pretty much wrapped up. What did you think overall of a lot of the guys that you kind of saw? At least as of right now. Of course, it is summer league, so as we've always mentioned, you got to take things with a grain of salt. But how do you feel about this draft class going into next season?
Oh, I love it. I
Mhm.
think it's way more stacked than what people kind of let on, right? There's so many hidden gems. Obviously, we can lightly touch on the top end talent of the draft, right? Like Dylan Harper,
Mhm.
everything as advertised. Cooper Flag,
Right.
pretty much as advertised, and even guys like VJ Edgecombe. I think we've seen enough to the point where okay, we know what kind of guy he's going to be, but he also has tons of star potential. Ace
Mhm.
Bailey would have liked to have seen a little bit more from him. Derek Queen as well. Unfortunately, with his injury, I think that puts him out a
Right.
little bit. Um, so
He was
we'll
cursed.
exactly yeah. So that's crazy injury luck. Who else? I think Trey Johnson looks like he's going to be a pretty good scorer in the league. So overall, I've been thoroughly impressed. Even defensively, like a guy like Carter Bryant, it's amazing. You can see why teams really did trade up to get some of these guys.
Mhm.
Like Hansen Yang as well. He continued, I think, to do pretty well. But yeah, I mean, the draft class is deep for sure. There's guys outside of the lottery that I'm excited for, and I think that's a good sign.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the key thing where you have the combination of this year, the top of the draft, you have some players that project to be really awesome. Like there were no, like say like last year, most people felt like the draft was deep, but the variance level between the guys wasn't quite as, you know, pronounced. Like say obviously everybody now likes Ricochet,
Yeah,
but we don't know ultimately what his ceiling will be,
yeah,
right? Like I don't think we're assuming that his ceiling is going to be that of like a all NBA level guy. Who knows, maybe, but that's not how we felt really about almost any of the players from last year's draft, right? Maybe like a couple, but just as a whole, that's not what we thought. But this year's draft, right, is different because you have the combination of the guys at the top, plus, like you said, a number of players after the top guys, right, that we expect to be good contributors right away. Like you mentioned Carter Bryant, right? Like that's a guy that could probably play worst case scenario, 15 minutes a night for the Spurs, right? Coming out of
yeah.
the gates, just 'cause that's a guy that you can put out there and have him guard other teams opposing wings or whatever, right?
Hmm.
So just things like that. Like you mentioned, the Queen injury sucks. Because I think it's what 12 weeks, so you're pretty much talking about going into this season, right? Because
Yeah,
I mean,
man.
12 weeks. I think that was announced a few days ago. So I mean, 12 weeks. I mean, I guess that's like what 3 months or so. So
About
yeah, that takes like yeah, so that takes you into October. So he'll definitely miss the rest of the summer. So whatever he's planning on doing, he'll have to probably make some changes to his plans, and then going into preseason and potentially regular season because now the season starts third week of October or so. So, like, he's gonna miss at least maybe a chunk of the regular season. So, and it's a shame, right? Because you know, in the summer league, like he started off kind of weird, but he did kind of look better over the course of each game.
mm,
Like in that last game before he got hurt, I think he had what a 20-10 game with 3 assists and a couple blocks. So, again, not a perfect player, but we talked about it at that time where we're like we like him as a player, just maybe not quite as much on New Orleans, right? So that's kind of the issue there, but we'll see. But I think a lot of the players in this draft you should look out for because just as a whole, like even outside of the top groups, is there any one guy like other than like the obvious ones that you're like really excited to see going into next season?
small sample sizes for these guys, but Neat Clifford,
Hmm.
that's one guy who's like who who's got I think a ton of potential to be such a well-rounded guard. And yeah, 18 and a half, 5 assists. um, 6.5 rebounds per game. So, I mean, hey, that could be really good for Sacramento. So very well put together player for sure. He's got my eye. Walter Clayton Jr. That's another one. Definitely has my eye as well, especially after seeing him in person. That was pretty spectacular. Very high IQ, and I think that will take him very far in the league. I would also have to shout out Liam McNeely. I know a lot of people didn't necessarily like that pick initially, but yeah, he's a baller for sure. I think he hits timely shots. His debut was pretty fantastic, so I think Charlotte did a good job in this draft, and yeah, those would probably be the three guys where I'm like, okay, outside of the top ones, I'm watching them.
Right. Yeah. I guess I'll mention a few ones as well. I
Yeah.
mean, a guy like a Cedric Coward, he hasn't really played in the summer league,
Mm-hmm.
so I guess he's hurt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's the
Um,
case.
right. So we'll see what he looks like. But for Memphis, if he could be a guy that can come in and just be like a solid 3-and-D wing, that could kind of help raise the floor for for Memphis when we see them play. Because the last half of last season, right, they couldn't guard anyone. So could he help them out there? And that's a team that's a little bit different because they're not really a rebuilding team. Couple other guys, right? That Asa Newell, right? Because like you mentioned, when we first saw him in the summer
Ooh.
league for the Hawks, he looked kind of rough right around the edges. But then as the game went on, and then as his time in the summer league went on, he looked better and better, and looked a lot more like the guy that everybody projected him as, where he's like this super versatile guy, forward that can rebound and defend and and hit shots and everything, right? That's that where you kind of feel like, oh wow, Atlanta might have gotten a real steal, going into this next season. Even a guy where I don't think he'll probably play like a ton of minutes, but like maybe a guy like maybe a guy like a Joan Behringer, right? Because that's another big that you're kind of looking at where it's like, hey, if he can get some real minutes, say like there may be a stretch where like a Rudy Gobert is out, or maybe Naz Reid has to miss a few games, and you just kind of have to insert kind of like an energy guy into the game, and maybe get like a guy that can give you a little bit more defense and shot block and also athleticism, right? Because Gobert, even though he can catch lobs and whatnot, he's not quite the same guy. But could that be like, not that he's like your future franchise center, but could he be just a decent rotational big? In different stretches, or even like Yakasionis, because that's another guy, right, that looked kind of rough early on, but then he looked better as time went on for the Heat. So could he be a guy that maybe plays his way into rotation? Because we know that the Heat have kind of been able to find diamonds in the rough, where it's like some people kind of like these players, but people aren't really looking at them as like guys that like you're kind of expecting to draft, but then they kind of come in and you're like, oh wow, how'd they get that guy? So I'm kind of curious to see what those guys do or look like as rookies, just because hey, they could be really fun
Yeah.
pieces. Like you said, outside of the obvious guys, is there anybody based off of let's say let's ignore the bottom part of the lottery, but let's say within the top 10, are there any guys that you're kind of like you're a little bit kind of worried or concerned about?
Um, I think what Fears was picked. What, 7?
7, 7.
Yeah, I'm worried about him for sure. I don't think he's put it together yet, right? Greatest handle, best handle in the draft, hands down. However, I'm not too high on the shooting, the finishing, everything else but the handle, and that's the unfortunate part, right? I don't know how far that can really take him. I see the upside, I see the potential. Do I like him developing in New Orleans? Absolutely not. That's probably worst case scenario. But that's the guy where I'm like, so much talent, potentially a bad situation, bad setting for sure. I think for his development, and I'm just not sure how good he's going to be. So that would be probably one of them.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point, right?
Yeah.
And then, for the Nets, I'm curious about Yegor Demin, right?
Yeah.
Because obviously, he's a guy that's going to come in and be one of many of their point guard ball handlers on the team, right? But at the same time, he does have length, so he could be a good defensive guard, but I'm just not quite sure, if he's going to be drafted top 10. I think we need to see more from him offensively. I need to see him be a little bit more comfortable of a shooter. And again, it's summer league, so just because a guy looks kind of funky in summer league, that doesn't automatically mean that he's gonna be complete, garbage or whatever as a rookie. Because we've seen that many times over, including star players. But just as a whole, it is something to be concerned about because it's kind of like what you said in the past. Like it's hard to be like a huge fan of the guys who are taller ball handlers that need the ball in their hands but don't really shoot the ball that great. It's just kind of hard, to kind of build a team with that as like your point guard centerpiece. I think that's a little bit difficult. And he was taken 8th overall, so he's the guy that I think probably has the most pressure of all the Nets picks. Because say some of the other guys like a Danny Wolf, say he doesn't pan out, it's whatever. He's the 27th pick of the draft, right? And either way, he's looked fine, right? But your expectations for what you want him to be is a lot different. But if they had taken Danny Wolf 8th overall, you'd be a little bit more like, oh wow, that's kind of a reach, right? But that would kind of be one of the guys that I would keep my eye on. Because like some of the other guys, like Murray Boyles, I think will be a good all-around versatile defensive guy.
Mm-hmm.
I know not a whole lot has been said about him because there
Mm-hmm.
hasn't been a whole lot of focus on the Raptors and all the weird cuckoo things they've been doing with their team.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's a fine pick, for them. I'm
Mm-hmm.
just curious to see how all of that works together and I'm sure that'll be fun when we talk about
Oh yeah,
the Raptors offseason
it'll
and their
be a
roster.
grade.
And then like a guy like Malawak, right? Because of the fact that we haven't seen him with like a lot of high level playmaking guards. That'll look different, because he didn't even look horrible, right? It's
No,
just like
look fine.
it looked kind of funky early. So we just got from Shams Charania that they waived Jordan Goodwin, right? So then that's pretty much what they're gonna do in order to sign Marcus Smart. So that probably suggests they weren't able to really find any deals as of right now. And they probably were like, well, we can't really wait but so long, right? Because you could potentially lose out on him. Not saying that it's 100% guarantee, but you want to get that wrapped up. And again, I think the preference would have been to not have to waive him, but you also have to figure like, well, there's only but so many guards that can really be in the rotation. And, Smart is not quite as much of a guard at this point, right? But as you upgrade your roster, some of those other guys on the bottom half of the roster aren't going to play as much. And again, he had some versatility as a rebounder and defender and whatnot. So it's not even like he's, bad, but,
Mm-hmm.
like it's Marcus Smart. So you can't necessarily just be like, well, shoot, I don't want to have to get rid of Jordan Goodwin because then we can't, and then we can't get Marcus Smart. That's not a great position to be in. So you do what you have to do. Not fun, not ideal, but it is what it is.
Yeah, it's a casualty, but I don't think you'll be missing, what Jordan Goodwin brings to the table because now you do have Marcus Smart.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you could look at it as like, he does bring some things as a rebounder and whatnot. So like, and that can help you in the regular season.
Sure.
And you do need guys that can help get you through the regular season, but it's not the end of the world. I would say I wouldn't
Yeah.
necessarily, crash out over
Yeah.
George Goodwin getting waived.
Yeah, exactly.
I know some will, right? But just as a whole, it'll be okay.
Mm.
Right? It's not the most ideal situation, but you did get some solid players to round out the rotation.
Yeah.
I guess if you want to mention some other free agencies as well, since it's been a minute, and in fairness, we are still waiting for some other guys to get signed. Do you have kind of like a favorite free agency signing so far?
I would probably have to go with probably Clint to the Rockets. Clint Capella. I think that's a great signing because it doubles down on their identity. It gives you Steven Adams somewhat insurance because we do know that he did, he can miss time during the regular season. So, bringing in him and kind of stealing him from, I think, a lot of teams. Nobody really expected Houston to be in play there. So I really like that. And, it just contributes to an amazing offseason that they've had.
Yeah, that would be a really good one. Do you have maybe one that's like a least favorite? No, that's a little bit tougher because there's not quite as many like terrible signings, and like it's different now because like even when we heard about some of the contracts later on, then it's like, oh, this guy got a 4-year deal, but then it's like, oh well, like it's only 2 years guaranteed.
Yeah, I'm trying to think because I mean I really did like a lot of the signings. I mean, if you want me to be funny, I would say my least favorite was probably Marvin Bagley going back to the Wizards. I don't really
That's
understand that
funny.
one, but
Hmm.
in terms of the big ones, I mean, I think everybody who was a big time target, I kind of like, right? Like I'm looking at it, I like John Collins and him, ending up with the Clippers. Um, but I already talked about Clint Capella. Um, Even Drummond, I actually like Drummond going back to Philly. Um,
Um, one that would kind of be like this is kind of a weird one, and I'm
mm,
not saying like I wouldn't call it like the worst signing in the world. Is like the Schroeder one to Sacramento just feels kind of
yeah,
weird in my opinion. Like again, it's not like he's getting a ton of money. He's getting like what a little under 15 million a year for 3 years, and they do have a lot of guards. They don't have a lot of point guards, so to be fair, but like you have Fox, you have Levine. It just feels like you don't really need a Dennis Schroeder like type of guard, like since you have those guys. I know he's a little bit, he's better defensively. But I just feel like of the guards they already have, like it just feels kind of pointless in my opinion. Like, but it's not like the equivalent of going back like a few years ago where it was like what, like Otto Porter Jr. for 4 years, 100 million, or like Alan Crabb for like 3-4 years, 80 million or whatever. It's not like those levels bad. We don't get those really anymore.
yeah.
But there were some, that was kind of one of the more wacky signings. I would definitely say.
I think Kevon Looney to the Pelicans. That was one that was kind of funny too.
Yeah, like and like say that was one where initially when we heard about it, we were like, "What the heck?"
Yeah,
But now the difference is, I think like the second year was non-guaranteed, and it was like a team option or something like that. So that's not like quite as bad as if it was just like
sure.
2 straight years of guarantee. Not that the 2 year deal is horrible, anyways, but at the very least you have an early out if something doesn't work out. But it was definitely like you said, one of the weirdo, wacky ones, and then I guess like sneaky underrated signing. You got
Mm,
one?
mm, I like ties to Orlando a lot. I really do like
That was
that
one I was
one.
thinking.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
that was one I was thinking.
um I
Another
I like the Fred Van Vliet re-signing and restructuring of his contract. I like that.
Yeah, I one that I would kind of point out is I think and I'm not saying like, oh, book it, send them to put them hang a banner because of this signing, but like the Yabu Sele signing for the Knicks, I think that's a good one just
Hmm.
because he was a good player for Philly last year and he plays a position that they don't really have a lot of. Like the last year they really didn't have anybody who was like a natural four. It was either, like guys who were more so like threes, but they're kind of forced into playing the four, like say like a OG Anunoby, or even like Marcus Smart would be like a small ball four, or it'd be like Towns, where it's like he's a center size, but he's playing the four because of his floor spacing abilities. But like a guy like Yabusele, he's more of a natural four, where it's like he's not really a wing and he's not a center. He could play like small ball center, but that could add a little bit of versatility. Like they did a decent job where it's like they didn't add any big names, but they added, real guys who can be like a legitimate piece of an NBA rotation. Like,
Yeah,
and
Jordan
they didn't have a
Clarkson.
lot of those guys last year.
Yeah.
It was kind of vying for what was it, like Landry Shamet and DeLon Wright and campaign minutes, right? So like, Jordan Clarkson and uh Yabusele, like those are I think good signings that can add to the depth of that team, to help them get through the season, right? Because so
Yeah.
that way, you're not overtaxing these guys by the time they get to the playoffs. Although, Cleveland learned that even doing that didn't matter because they remember they saddle or they load managed their guys all throughout the regular season. Those guys were not playing heavy minutes, and then in the playoffs, it didn't matter. They still got hurt anyways.
Yeah, for sure. I would agree with that. The Knicks definitely had a great free agency.
Yeah. So, and again, this is just kind of a little brief conversation because we'll get into more detail about specific teams as we go on into the offseason, right? Because now that Summer League is over, now you're kind of in the dead zone of the NBA where maybe trades will happen potentially that we don't see coming, right? And we'll talk about those as they happen or, when they happen on our podcast. But there's, outside of that, no more basketball from at least NBA basketball. And then, you're going to have to wait until about September or so before you have training camp and then October for preseason. So
Yeah.
we're a ways away from that, but obviously we're going to continue to find ways to continue to put content out there, for everybody.
Yep.
Yeah. So in terms of news and rumors around the league, not really a lot at this point, just because again, we're still kind of just waiting for some of these other guys to be signed, right? Like, we're still waiting on Kaminga to, for in the Warriors to figure that situation out. And then from there, we're still waiting on guys like Horford and DeAnthony Melton and Chris Paul and Russell Westbrook. And all those guys, like I said, I think are just in a holding period until something happens with those situations. There was one that we actually didn't mention, I think the last time that we talked, and that was Cam Thomas, because we didn't even really
Mm-hmm.
talk about him, and he kind of made some headlines, right? Because he was on social media and he kind of responded to, like I guess, a line, right? That was mentioned on Zach Lowe's podcast, where he was talking about, where he was on a podcast, I think with Nikias Duncan, I think is his name, and they were talking about restricted free agency and the players that are kind of in a holding spot, and he was talking about Cam Thomas, and he was basically saying like that he was saying on his podcast, quote, the consensus on Cam Thomas, if there is one, and he's got some fans, he's got some mega detractors, but the consensus is kind of like an empty calories ball hog, right? So end quote. And then that made Cam Thomas spawn on social media. Not going to say everything that he said, but he was not particularly thrilled with what was said. He was like, basically like, yeah, you got, you're nuts in terms of your consensus, and basically saying like, these are the same people who same teams who can't guard me and send double teams from the jump ball. Why are we double teaming a guy who's not that good? Make it make sense, please. Right? So, the thing with him, right, as that many people have said, is they don't feel like he impacts winning. I mean, in fairness, this season, before the Nets got kind of off the rails in terms of what they were doing, like they had a good record. Like they were a sneaky good team
Mm-hmm.
during, the earlier part of the season, and he was a big part of that. Now, in fairness, didn't play a whole lot, right? But how much of that was him being legitimately hurt and having to miss a ton of time versus like they were kind of sitting him out? He only played in 25 games. In those 25 games, he gave him 24 and 4. And again, like on a team that doesn't have a lot of high end talent, like I mean, he still gave him 25 a game, which is not the easiest thing in the world to do. Really, the issue with him is the defense. He's just not a good defender. Really, outside of that, like offensively, he's a very good scorer. Is he like a guy that you'd want as your number one scoring option on a really good team? No, you wouldn't. But can he be a guy that can contribute to a team and be instant offense? Like, yeah, sure, absolutely. Because I mean, again, like I said before, all that stuff happened with the Nets. He was a driver for their offense earlier in the year when they were a good team. So again, I don't necessarily think he said anything terrible, because it wasn't like he was saying Cam Thomas is garbage, right? He was mainly talking about the general consensus. But I can also understand, from Cam Thomas's perspective, like, hold on a second, right? Like, you're not just going to double team just anybody. Like, they're not going to send double teams after, like bench guys, right? Or, on that doesn't normally happen. Like, say, not to try to pick on somebody specifically, but say, like, if you're looking at, like, I don't know, the Lakers roster, right? Like, there are guys on the back half of the roster that you're not necessarily going to double team. Like, Vincent's a fine player. You're probably not sending a double team towards Gabe Vincent, or you're
Right.
probably not sending a double team towards like a Jared Vanderbilt.
Right.
For your Wizards, right? You're probably not sending double teams, towards like an Alex Sarr, at least not as of right now.
Yeah.
Maybe down the line, but just as a whole. But I also think the other thing for him is he doesn't have a contract right now, right? He's a restricted free agent. So I'm sure there's some frustration there where it's like, in the games and the minutes that I played, I put up good numbers that on paper should be worthy enough to get some type of decent money, but I
Yeah.
don't have it. So how much money is he looking for?
They said
Probably more
30.
than what. Yeah, 30 million a year or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Probably more than what Brooklyn really wants to give him. And Brooklyn does have all the leverage because, where else is he going to go to get that money? He can't really go anywhere. So this is kind of similar to Giddey and Kaminga, right? Where good player, But, the difference is I think if you're Brooklyn, like you're okay with having Cam Thomas for a while, right? Like I could see like a 3-year deal, right? Where it's like, 20 something million a year or whatever, like, or maybe not like a 5-year deal. Same with Giddey. Like I don't think those guys are 30 million a year players, but like, they're guys where if they can kind of come down and find some middle ground, I think you could do that. The only one is probably Kaminga, where again, not that he can't get a certain contract, but it's more so like the Warriors don't want him. Like I think the Bulls would be okay with having Giddey back, and I think Brooklyn would be all right with having Cam Thomas back, but at their price. With the Warriors, like I think ideally both sides probably want to move on from one another. So hopefully the situation gets resolved soon. But what do you think of Cam Thomas? Because I know you probably are, because I think we both like him. I think you're higher on him than me,
Hmm.
but I think both of us feel like this guy's a good player. And, depending on what team he's on, he can certainly help a team, like, because say the last couple of years, Brooklyn's rosters haven't been very good. So I'm not necessarily going to hold it against him for, putting up good numbers on a bad team. Because I feel like we saw, and maybe it could have been a fluke, but I feel like we saw before Brooklyn's season just kind of went haywire. And they wanted it to be like that. They wanted to lose games, but during that stretch where they were winning too much, like he was helping them win. So like I think he can clearly be like a helpful player on a good team. It's not like this guy is just kind of like a, you know, a whatever in my opinion.
Yeah, he's a great player. Like you said, scoring is his strong suit. Passing, playmaking, and defense are probably not. The things that you would ask him to do.
Mhm.
He's a walking spark plug, walking microwave. So, yeah, I mean, and you're right. Like when they were, I think, fifth in the East and sixth in the East or whatever, right? Like, yeah, they were hooping, and it was because of Cam Thomas, right? He was putting up monster numbers, monster scoring performances, and carrying the load. That's what happens. And then he got hurt, and things fell into their favor or whatever, right? Like you said, that's how they wanted their season to be. So it is tough. Do I think he's $30 million worth of a player? That's the tough part, right? I think on Brooklyn, yeah, for sure. But elsewhere, no. And I think that's what Brooklyn's trying to grapple with, right? Like, what is the market for a Cam Thomas? Like that's my question. Like, is there one at all? Could he be useful on another team? Would another team be, trying to, um, you know, potentially go after him? I remember I had him as a deadline candidate or a deadline guy to watch at the deadline, and nothing really happened, and nothing came of that. So I don't think there's truly a market for him. I think there is this unfortunate stigma of this is a very ball dominant player on a very bad team, and that's what he is. And for some reason, people don't think he can succeed elsewhere. I think he can for sure coming off the bench. He would give you efficient offensive games, but like you said, there is just that liability of being so bad at defense. And I think that archetype of players, I mean, I could literally list, multiple guys that would probably fit the mold for this, right? Like a Rob Dillingham, like a Bones Highland, like guys like that, where they have a lot of offensive, uh, great offensive characteristics, but they can't play defense at all. So they get played off the floor. And I think that's what would probably happen with Cam Thomas if he went elsewhere.
Yeah, and then like in fairness, he's improved as a playmaker. He averaged just under 4 assists a
Mm-hmm.
game, last season. So if he can continue to make strides there, that's what can kind of put him above, like you said, the tier of like, yeah, probably, like that could probably put him in the tier of like potential starter on a team if he could be like a better playmaker, right?
Mm-hmm.
Versus like just the classic sixth man scoring role, right? Because, say like a Jordan Poole, right? Like the thing with him is like, yeah, he's kind of a similar scorer offensively, right? But, he made some real strides as a passer playmaker, especially the year they won the championship, where, he's not necessarily like a point guard, but he was able to make those extra reads and the extra passes, which he wasn't able to do as a rookie. So if he can get to that point, then, again, is he the ideal starting backcourt, secondary guard? Probably not, but like he can do it. But, but if he's just kind of like just shoot first, shoot second, shoot third, and then like way down the line there's a huge gap. And then it's like, yeah, now I'm going to pass.
Right.
Then that's probably not as ideal. Again, he's what, 23, 24, so he's still a pretty young guy. So I think there's still some room for him to grow there. And, So I think he can continue to be better. So, hopefully Brooklyn can kind of figure out the situation. Do you have any teams that you would like to see him on? Like, or
Ooh,
and maybe like a tricky question, like, could you see a team where you might like to see him as an actual starter?
ooh, that's a heavy question. Off rip,
Right.
off rip. No, I have no idea where he would go. Like I
Right.
said, I don't know the market for the guy. I don't think there really is one outside of Brooklyn, right?
Hmm.
That's the thing. Um, yeah, it's tough because a lot of teams already have their starting guard, and like
Right.
that, it's worked. It's working. It's going to work.
Right.
Um,
Like that's the tough part because like how many teams have a spot at the guard spot available? Like, say like if you're LA, you're probably fine with the guards right now. Like you're probably not swapping out like Austin Reeves for Cam Thomas. Like you're probably fine with that, with having Austin Reeves, right? So, and then like I said, with a lot of these other teams, where like you said, where's the room?
I mean, like
Where's the
maybe
guard room?
maybe Minnesota, but like money wise, you're not making that work. And then on top
Right.
of that, you're adding another ball dominant player alongside two other guys that need the ball, and two of them are gonna be at the guard position. So
Right. It's
like,
a
I
different
don't think it's
type
gonna
of
be in the West. It would have to be in the
yeah,
East somewhere.
it's a different type of player, but it's kind of the conundrum that I mentioned with Jalen Green, where that was kind of why at least as of right now, not quite as like sold on like the fact that they are going to trade him relatively soon. Because I'm like, go look, go look at what
Yeah,
teams like can realistically be like, yeah, let's trade for a Jalen Green, on our team, right? Like because we have an open spot at the guard, where he can slide right in. There's just not a lot of teams that really fit that bill.
yeah,
So that's where, like you said, we are seeing at least the tiers below those guys where like kind of the classic bench scoring but smaller ish type of guard, like that's not as valuable anymore, right? Where like those guys are, if they get traded, they're literally being acquired for nothing. And now even more so, they're just getting bought out and just kind of just getting waived and leaving their team. So, like I said, I've liked more and more of what I've seen from Cam Thomas as like he's been in the league for longer. It's just like you said, it's just tricky to figure out like a team that he could go to because it's like especially because like in the last couple of seasons, some of these teams have made additional moves where it's like, yeah, there's probably not as much room now. Like say San Antonio, they have a bunch of guards now where it's like, not that they were ever in on Cam Thomas, but like now they have guards that are capable of scoring the basketball where they didn't have that a couple seasons ago. So like that's a tricky area, right? Like, so and then you look around at some of these other teams like Houston. I mean, they don't really need that because now you got Durant, and then you have the big man presence with Şengün. So maybe you might like a scoring guard, but like in terms of that group, probably just rather have like a 3-and-D guard
yeah.
as opposed
I
to
would.
like another ball handling scoring guard. So that's where it gets really tricky. Like you said, Minnesota could be interesting, but how do you put together that deal? What do you have to do in order to get it together, right?
Exactly.
How much are you giving him a year? What are you giving up? I guess as of right now, like you'd rather have Cam Thomas than Dillingham. Cam Thomas isn't a point guard, but how much of a traditional point guard do you need next to Ant? I mean, it seems like whenever Mike Conley isn't out there, they don't look very good. Although at this point, he's not quite what he used to be anyway. So that's kind of a tough thing, I think, to kind of figure out and thread the needle for. So, what do you think ultimately happens with Cam Thomas? Do you think they find some type of number to agree on, and then maybe it's just not like a 5-year deal, or what do you think?
Yeah, I think it's gonna have to be, one of those things where they find a number that works. That's also, doesn't
Mhm.
put Brooklyn in a potential deficit, right? So there's gonna be
Yeah,
sacrifices, I think, for both sides.
yeah. And then I guess I think the one that we also didn't spend a whole lot of time on, we don't have to spend as much time on it, is Giddey. What do you think of Giddey in terms of like for the Bulls, like in terms of what your expectation is there? Because he's another guy that's kind of a tricky archetype of a player, right? Where it's like tall guard who's got some skills as a passer playmaker, good rebounder, but then it's like aside from that latter part of the season, not known for being a great outside shooter, not known for being a defender, not really a great athlete either. So as a finisher, it takes a little bit more work for him to be able to kind of do a lot of that. So what's the market for him? And it's like I don't know how many other teams are jumping out of their sneakers to try to sign a Josh Giddey. So I feel like that's another guy again that probably goes back, but again, probably not at the contract he wants. But like, how do you feel about him versus a Cam Thomas?
I mean, they're in similar tiers, right? I think, underrated for sure, especially in terms of what they do and what they do bring to a team, right? Cam Thomas can bring you that scoring 24/7, like that water never shuts off. And then Josh Giddey is pretty much, this well-rounded big guard that has, all-star potential, whatever the case may be, however you feel about him. So, tons of potential in terms of where they could go. I think they both want reportedly like around $30 million. So
Right.
I don't know if Josh Giddey is worth 30 mil a year. That's the problem. But also the other problem is, well, I think the Nets and the Bulls are the only teams that can sign those guys, with that kind of cap space. So, yeah, I think they'll both end up being on the teams. It's just not going to be the numbers that they want, unfortunately, because I don't foresee a sign and trade. I don't think anything would come of that. So,
Yeah. And then I guess like what are your views on like say you put Giddey in a different environment? Do you think he could be like a foundational guard for another team?
mm,
It's
maybe.
tricky, right?
Maybe. Maybe.
Yeah,
I
it's
mean,
tricky.
like, we kind of saw that in Oklahoma City and didn't go too hot. So,
Right.
yeah, I don't think he could really be all that great on a contender. I think he needs to be on a rebuilding team because he's
Yeah.
so
So
young.
in other words, like the Bulls.
Yeah, exactly. I think the Bulls is best case scenario for him, as well as the Nets for Cam Thomas.
Yeah. So that's and you're right. That's kind of what and like I said, that's what I think is going to happen ultimately. I'm just curious to see how long does it go? Does it go into August? I mean, they could technically
True.
go, I guess, as
True.
long as they want,
Yeah.
but we'll see what happens. So at any rate, whenever it happens, that'll probably be like the next string of topics that we'll talk
Yeah.
about. But hopefully it happens relatively soon, but
Right.
we don't know at this point. And
Yeah.
we've already talked about Kaminga, so we don't really have to go any further than that. But now, guess we'll just close it out. Back to what we normally do at the end of the episodes, right? Great format with the polling that we did on IG. And the last thing that we had was, are the Clippers championship contenders? And 100% of the responses were no.
Yeah.
And now we talked about that in our last episode where we went over the Western Conference and kind of looked at all the teams, put them into tiers a little bit, not like a completely in-depth conversation. But I think we kind of were at the point where like the Clippers are going to be a really good team. They'll probably be a top 6 seed just like last year. But I don't foresee a scenario where they get to the finals unless things really, really, really go their way. Now it's tough because we haven't had a team go back to back. We haven't had a team go to back finals. We haven't had a team get out of the second round in almost a decade. So history tells us OKC will probably not get to the conference finals or win the title next year. They're set up for the future and they're set up for now. So they feel like the team that could actually break the streak, although we thought Boston could be that, and that ended up not happening. But I think for the Clippers, I think best case scenario, conference finals. Most likely scenario, either second round or first round exit, which is kind of where I think most of the non-Oklahoma City teams are as of right now. Where I'm like, outside of maybe like Denver, potentially Houston, I think we need to see a little bit more from their young guys. I'm not quite ready to automatically just crown them as the second best team in the Western Conference. But after those three, most of the other teams, I'm like, they could go to the second round. They could lose in the first round. If things go their way, maybe they're in the conference finals, but I think that might be a little bit of a stretch. Like say when we were talking about the Lakers, right? We like their signings. We like a number of the players on their roster, but as of right now, I don't feel confident in saying that they, can get out of the West. I don't think they can realistically do that, let alone win the championship. The ceiling for them, like I said, is probably conference finals if they're fortunate, but more than likely second or first round, right? Which is, like I said, where a lot of those other teams are. But for the Clippers, like, they're a contender. So I don't know if like I can completely agree with the poll, but what I would say is, for me personally, I usually try to divide championship team versus contender. I think the Clippers are a contender. I do not think they're a championship team because I
Yeah.
don't trust that I don't trust that Kawhi can stay healthy through 4 rounds. I don't trust James Harden. The deeper you go into a playoff series or in the postseason, and they also have, and assuming they add Chris Paul, then you're starting to veer into there's a number of guys on the roster that you're relying on that are older. Now they have shown they could get through last regular season, and they got through the regular season the year before. So with or without Kawhi, they're set to win regular season games. I just don't think that they're a championship level team. Maybe that's too low on them, but that's just my opinion.
Yeah, I would agree with you where I don't think they're there yet. We kind of need to see what it looks like in action. However, that doesn't, I don't think, change how we feel about their offseason. Great offseason.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, very good
Because
offseason.
last year, like, we thought it was horrible that they lost Paul George, and it was funny because we liked the individual signings. And initially, you're like, oh, maybe they could be good. But then it's like, oh, but they lost Paul George, and he was awesome last year. But then it was like, nope, they ended up being better, way better than expected. Now the difference is now they're going into next season where I think the expectation is that we know that they're going to be a good team, but are they going to be better than last year? And that's where it's tough because, like, they got better, but other teams in the West got better as well. And I just don't necessarily, like I said, believe that they can get all the way to the finish line. But, maybe they shock me and surprise me, but I feel like we've been saying that every year for the Clippers, where a lot of times they're one of those teams that's kind of in the realm of like, oh, watch out for them. They're a championship level team, which, again, they have the high end championship talent, but I just don't think they can get it done. And that's okay because they don't have their picks. So they need to be good anyways. There's no real reason for them to tank and blow it up because they don't have their picks. They don't have control over their future. So this is probably the best case scenario, given what could have happened, is that you shake it up with your roster. Paul George is gone, but now you go into the new arena. You have a good team that your fans can feel good about. Probably not going to win the championship, but is better than walking into a new arena with a garbage team that has no real chance of, like, not even winning 40 plus games. At least now you have a good team that you can feel okay about. It's not the worst place to be in for an NBA roster.
Exactly.
Well, that's it for today's episode of Off Ball Takes. Let us know your thoughts in the comments about the Marcus Smart signing, whether or not you think it's a needle mover for the Lakers. Let us know your thoughts about everything else that we've talked about, right? In terms of the Summer League, what did you think of it? How concerned or how impressed are you by the players? And let us know your thoughts on some of the restricted free agents. How much are you buying stock into them? And of course, let us know your thoughts on the Clippers. As we normally do, leave comments on any of our socials at the OBT podcast, or leave comments on our videos or shorts. And if we see them, we'll try to pick one and we'll read them out at the end of the episode like we normally do, and continue to like and subscribe. See you next time.